Story 1: The Vanishing Farm. The two-lane road stretched endlessly through the heart of the American countryside, flanked by miles of rusting barbed wire and golden fields of tall, unkempt grass. Jared Dawson drummed his fingers on the steering wheel of his old Chevy truck, squinting at the road ahead. He had been driving for nearly 2 hours since the last town, following vague directions scribbled on a gas station receipt. The job listing had been simple: farmhand needed, housing provided, good pay, no experience necessary. Jared had nothing to lose. Fresh out of jail on a minor charge, he had no family, no money, and nowhere else to go. If some backwoods farmer was willing to put cash in his pocket and a roof over his head, he wasn't about to ask too many questions. As the sun began to set, the road narrowed into a dirt path, leading deeper into a dense grove of twisted oak trees. His GPS had lost signal miles ago, and there were no signs marking the turnoff. Jared hesitated before continuing, feeling the crunch of gravel beneath his tires as he pressed forward. Then, through the trees, he saw it: Hollow Oak Farm. The farmhouse was old, its wooden frame warped and darkened with age. The barn loomed behind it, towering and silent, its red paint faded to a sickly brown. A windmill creaked in the distance, its rusted blades barely turning in the breeze. A man stood on the porch, waiting. Jared parked and stepped out. The man was tall and wiry, with a face that looked like it had been carved from leather. His eyes were small, dark, and unreadable beneath the shadow of his wide-brimmed hat. Jared lay in the small, musty bedroom, staring at the cracked ceiling. The mattress beneath him was thin, the sheets rough and stiff with age. Outside, the wind whispered through the trees, but there were no crickets, no night birds, just silence. Then he heard it, a low, distant moan. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't an animal. It was human. Jared sat up, his pulse quickening. The sound came from outside, near the barn, a long, agonized groan, stretching into the night. Amos's warning echoed in his head. Don't go near the barn after dark. Don't open your window. Jared hesitated. Every instinct screamed at him to ignore it, but curiosity gnawed at him. He crept to the window and peeked through the warped glass. The barn door was slightly ajar, and something moved in the darkness beyond it. A shadow, a tall, twisted figure, lurched forward, dragging something heavy behind it. Jared's breath hitched as he realized what it was. A body. He stumbled back from the window, his pulse hammering. The floorboards creaked under his feet, and he froze. A moment later, the moaning stopped, and then, slowly, the barn door closed. Jared forced himself to breathe. He climbed back into bed, pulling the covers up like a child hiding from monsters. Because now he was sure there were monsters here, and they weren't hiding. At dawn, Jared forced himself to act normal. He found Amos in the fields already working. The older man barely acknowledged him, handing him a rusty pitchfork. Jared wanted to ask about last night, about the moans, the shadow, the body, but he didn't. Instead, he worked in silence. As he stacked hay bales, he noticed something odd. A row of old boots, half buried in the dirt, all different sizes, all worn and sun-bleached. Too many for just Amos. Jared frowned. You have other workers here? Amos paused, gripping his shovel tighter. Had a few over the years, he said. They don't stick around. Something in his tone made Jared's skin crawl. You the new help? The man asked, his voice gravelly and slow. Yeah, Jared replied. Got your ad at the gas station. The man nodded, staring at him for a long moment before turning toward the house. Come on in. Got supper on the stove. Jared hesitated, but the promise of food outweighed his caution. He followed the man inside, the screen door slamming shut behind him. He didn't notice the missing person flyers tacked to a wooden post near the barn, and he didn't see the fresh mound of disturbed earth near the tree line. The farmhouse smelled of fried meat and stale wood smoke. Inside, the air was thick with humidity, the ceiling fan barely stirring the heat. Jared sat at the worn wooden table while the farmer ladled stew into a bowl and set it down in front of him. The man pulled out a chair across from him and finally introduced himself. "Name's Amos Renshaw. Been running this farm since my daddy left it to me." Jared nodded, shoveling a spoonful of food into his mouth. The stew was thick, the meat chewy and gamey. He didn't ask what it was. "You'll work the fields, mend the fences, and tend to the animals. Pay comes every Saturday." "Sounds good," Jared said between bites. "Got rules," Amos continued, his voice low. "Don't go near the barn after dark. Stay in your room at night. And if you hear anything outside, don't open your window." Jared smirked. "What, you got ghosts out here?" Amos didn't laugh. Jared let it go. Maybe the guy was just superstitious. Either way, he needed this job, so he wasn't about to argue. As he finished eating, he glanced around. The walls were lined with old photographs. Black and white pictures of men standing in the same yard outside. Their faces serious, their eyes hollow. Something about them made his stomach twist. "Get some sleep," Amos said, standing. "Work starts at dawn." Jared nodded, but as he climbed the narrow staircase to his room, a strange feeling settled in his gut. Something about this place felt wrong, and he hadn't even heard the screams YETWY midday. Jared had worked up enough nerve to ask about the barn. "What's in there?" he asked, wiping sweat from his brow. Amos didn't look up. "Tools, feed, ain't your concern." Jared noticed how Amos never went near it, how the barn's padlock was new, while everything else on the farm was old and worn. That night, when Amos was snoring in his room, Jared decided he couldn't ignore it anymore. He grabbed a flashlight and crept outside. The night air was thick and too quiet. His boots crunched on the dirt, each step too loud. As he reached the barn, he hesitated. His fingers brushed the cold padlock. Then a whisper, right behind him. "Help me." Jared spun around, his flashlight trembling. No one was there, but the barn door was slightly open now. And inside, something shifted in the darkness. Jared pushed the door open, heart pounding. The smell hit him first. Rot, damp earth, something foul. Inside, the floor was layered with hay, but something was off. He stepped forward, and his boots sank. He kicked the hay aside and saw it. A hole. A deep, gaping pit, dug straight into the barn floor. Its edges were uneven. The dirt clawed at like something had tried to climb out. Jared's stomach churned. He aimed his flashlight into the pit. At the bottom, bones. Skulls. Dozens of them. And then something moved down there. Jared stumbled back, his breath ragged. A hand, skeletal but moving, clawed at the dirt, reaching up. Jared turned to run, but Amos was standing in the doorway. "You shouldn't have done that, boy." Jared backed away, heart hammering. "Amos. What the hell is this?" Amos sighed, stepping forward. "They don't leave, you know. None of them. Just keep coming back hungry." Jared's mouth went dry. "Who?" Amos tipped his hat back. "The ones who came before you." From the pit, the moaning started again. Jared's legs locked in fear as something began to rise from the hole. A figure, draped in ragged flesh, its hollow eyes fixed on him. Then another, and another. The pit was full of them. Amos stepped back. "You'll see soon enough." And then he shoved Jared in. Jared hit the dirt hard. The wind knocked from his lungs. Above, Amos was already dragging the barn door shut. Jared scrambled up, but hands clamped around his ankles. Cold, strong, dead. The pit swarmed with them. Former farmhands, their flesh rotting, their eyes filled with endless hunger. Jared kicked, fought, clawed, but the dirt swallowed him whole. And as the last sliver of moonlight vanished, the screaming began. A week later, a new flyer appeared at a gas station 2 towns over. Farmhand needed, housing provided, good pay, no experience necessary, and Hollow Oak Farm waited, hungry as ever. Story 2. The Cursed Mine. Tom Wilson was desperate. When he saw the ad for a job in the mining town of Black Hollow, he didn't hesitate. Workers needed, good pay, housing provided. When the bus dropped him off in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by nothing but dark woods and empty roads. He felt a chill creep up his spine. The town was old, run down, and eerily quiet, but the promise of steady work and a roof over his head was too tempting. The mine was located on the outskirts of town, nestled against a jagged hill that seemed to swallow the light. As Tom approached, he saw a few men milling about, their faces gaunt and their eyes hollow. They didn't look like miners. They looked like they had been mining for far too long. "You're the new guy?" A voice rasped behind him. Tom turned to see a man in his mid-40s with a weathered face, his clothes covered in dust. "Yeah," Tom said, trying to hide his unease. "I'm here for the job." "Follow me," the man said, leading him toward the mine. "But remember this, don't stay down there too long." Tom didn't know if the man was just joking or if there was something more to his warning. He didn't have time to dwell on it, though. He needed the money. The mine was a labyrinth of tunnels that twisted and turned in every direction. Inside, it was cold, damp, and smelled of rust and decay. The air was thick with dust, and the deeper Tom went, the harder it became to breathe. As Tom worked, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Every time he entered the deeper tunnels, the oppressive silence was broken only by the occasional echo of distant, unexplained whispers. The men who worked with him didn't talk much, their faces hollow and tired. When Tom tried to strike up a conversation, they merely stared at him blankly, as if they hadn't heard a word he said. One night, as he was walking through a particularly dark section of the mine, he heard the sound of footsteps behind him. But when he turned around, no one was there. The air grew colder, and the whispers grew louder. "Who's there?" Tom called out, his voice trembling. No answer. Suddenly, he heard a low, guttural growl from the darkness ahead of him. He froze, his heart racing. The next morning, Tom decided to confront the man who had hired him. He found him sitting on a bench outside the mine, smoking a cigarette. "Is something wrong with the mine?" Tom asked, trying to keep his voice steady. The man looked at him for a long time before answering. "You're hearing the voices, aren't you?" he said quietly. Tom nodded. "What's going on in there?" The man took a long drag from his cigarette, then exhaled slowly. "It's the curse of Black Hollow Mine. The workers here, they never leave. Once you go deep enough, you can't come back. Those whispers you're hearing, those are the souls of the men who went before you, trapped forever in the dark." Tom felt his blood run cold. "But why doesn't anyone talk about it?" The man shook his head. "We can't leave. The mine keeps us. Once you're in, you're part of it." Tom wanted to leave. He was about to turn and run, but something stopped him. An unseen force, a chilling feeling that gripped his chest and wouldn't let go. Later that evening, Tom went back down into the mine, determined to leave and never come back. But as he tried to climb the ladder back to the surface, the whispers became louder, more urgent. His hands slipped on the rungs, his breath quickening in panic. He heard a voice, soft but clear. "Stay with us, Tom. Forever." Suddenly, the ground beneath him gave way, and he plummeted into a pit. He landed hard, pain shooting through his body. When he looked up, he saw hundreds of eyes staring at him from the darkness. Souls of the lost workers, their faces twisted in agony. They reached out for him, pulling him into the dark. His scream was swallowed by the mine as the darkness closed in around him. A few weeks later, a new ad appeared in a nearby town. Workers needed at Black Hollow Mine. Good pay. Housing provided. Tom's body was never found. His disappearance, like those of countless others, was chalked up to the dangerous conditions of the mine. The workers spoke in hushed tones, but no one dared to speak too openly about the curse that haunted the depths. But the whispers never stopped. In the days that followed, new workers came and went, each one hearing the call of the mine, each one tempted by the promise of wealth and stability, only to disappear like the others before them. None of them ever reached the surface again. And those who had worked the mine for years, men who seemed too old to still be down there, no longer spoke. They just worked, endlessly, as if they too were part of something greater, something they couldn't escape. One evening, a new face arrived. A man named James Carter, fresh off a bus from a neighboring town. The same tired look in his eyes, the same hope for a fresh start. The foreman, a gaunt man with empty eyes, greeted him outside the mine with the same dead stare that Tom had received. "You're here for the job?" he asked in a voice too low to be comforting. "Yeah," James replied. "Heard it was good pay." The foreman nodded slowly. "It's always good pay at first." He paused, looking over his shoulder at the dark mouth of the mine. "But there are things down there you won't understand. Don't go too deep. Don't stay too long." James laughed nervously. "I'm not afraid of a little hard work." The foreman didn't smile. He just turned and walked toward the mine. "It's not the work you need to worry about." As James followed, he saw the men inside, working without pause, their faces blank, their eyes distant. He could hear the faint whispers, like the hum of a broken radio. As the day turned into evening, the air in the mine grew colder. James felt a sudden chill that seemed to crawl beneath his skin, as though something was watching him from the shadows. By the time night fell, the whispers had become more distinct. He could hear words now calling to him, join us forever." James shook his head, trying to block out the sound. It wasn't real, couldn't be. But when he turned around, the shadows in the mine seemed to grow, twisting and moving, beckoning him closer. He couldn't stop himself. He stepped deeper into the mine. James Carter never made it out of the mine. He fell, just like the others, into the depths where the lost souls of the workers waited. The darkness consumed him, and he became one with the others, his body joining the others in the pit. His face, pale and terrified, would soon become just another face among the hundreds that had come before him. Another soul trapped in the never-ending cycle of Black Hollow Mine. And as another ad appeared in the town, promising more workers for the cursed mine, the whispers continued, growing louder. For Black Hollow Mine had no end, only an eternal hunger, waiting for the next soul to feed upon. It had been years since anyone had dared to question the mystery of Black Hollow Mine. The town nearby, once thriving, had grown quiet, too quiet. Some residents had left, unable to bear the tension in the air, while others had grown too accustomed to the disappearing men. Few bothered to ask questions anymore. One cold autumn evening, a man named David Reynolds arrived in Black Hollow. Unlike the others before him, David had heard the rumors. He had come searching for answers, not just for a paycheck. He had seen the posters, heard the whispers from neighboring towns about the cursed mine. The moment he set foot in the town, David felt the weight of the air pressing down on him. It wasn't just the quietness. It was a palpable, suffocating feeling, as if the entire town was holding its breath. He could feel eyes watching him from the windows of empty houses. David made his way to the foreman's house, where the same gaunt man who had met James stood on the porch. "You here for the job?" the foreman asked in his low, gravelly voice, eyeing David with an unsettling intensity. "Yeah," David replied, trying to sound confident. "I heard this place had good pay, but I've also heard stories." The foreman didn't smile. He only looked down at the ground for a long moment before raising his gaze back to David's eyes. "You won't be the first to seek answers, but you'll be just like the rest." David hesitated, but the lure of the money and the promise of truth was too much. "I just need the job. I'm ready." The foreman finally nodded. "You're not going to like it here. The mine isn't what it seems, but you've made your choice." With that, David followed the foreman to the entrance of the mine, where the shadows seemed to stretch unnaturally long. The foreman handed him a helmet and a pickaxe, his eyes never leaving David's face. "The others will be waiting," the foreman muttered, his voice heavy with a strange warning. "But be careful. Once you're in, you won't want to stay, and you won't be able to leave." As David stepped into the mine, the air thickened, colder with every step he took. The faint whispers began almost immediately, curling around his mind like a snake, beckoning him deeper. At first, the men around him seemed normal, tired, yes, but still functional. They worked diligently, moving with mechanical precision as if they had no choice but to keep mining. But the deeper David ventured, the more unsettling the atmosphere became. It was no longer just the cold. It was as if the walls themselves were breathing, pulsing with an unnatural life. The whispers grew louder, clearer, and soon they weren't just whispers. They were voices. "Join us. Stay with us forever." David looked around, his skin crawling. He could see the faces of the workers now, their eyes wide and glassy, staring through him as if he didn't exist. One man's hand reached out to him, cold and shaking. Don't go deeper," the man whispered hoarsely, his voice barely audible. "Once you hear them, they won't let you go." David's heart raced. He tried to back away, but the deeper he went, the more his body seemed to lose control. The air grew thick, almost suffocating, and the walls of the mine closed in around him. His mind was clouded with visions of shadowy figures that had once been men, but were now twisted, their bodies contorted by something ancient and evil. Suddenly he saw it, the pit, a large, dark hole at the center of the mine, surrounded by bodies, piled on top of each other. Their skeletal hands reached out from the pile, and their empty eyes stared at him, pleading, desperate. "Help us," they whispered. "Help us end the curse." David's knees gave way as the voices swirled around him, growing deafening. His breathing became ragged, his chest tight. He felt a cold, unholy presence behind him, and when he turned, he saw it as a towering figure. Its eyes glowing with a sickly light, its face twisted in an eternal scream. The figure raised a skeletal hand, and David felt an icy chill pierce through him. "You are ours now," the figure said in a voice that sounded like 1,000 souls crying out in torment. David tried to scream, but no sound escaped his lips. He felt himself being pulled toward the pit, his body moving against his will as the darkness swallowed him whole. The next morning, the foreman stood at the mouth of the mine, waiting. His eyes narrowed as a new worker arrived, a young man named Michael Foster. His face was filled with uncertainty, but his hunger for work was greater. "You're here for the job, huh?" the foreman asked, his voice almost bored now. Michael nodded. "I'm here to work, and to find out what happened to the others." The foreman stared at him for a long time before speaking again. "You'll find out, but not the way you think." As Michael walked toward the mine, he could already hear the whispers calling to him from the depths. The cycle continued, and so it would, until the cursed mine had claimed its fill.